On the morning of December 16, 1944, deep within the dense, snow-laden Arden Forest, German senior commanders gathered around crude maps spread atop hastily arranged tables. The forest's thick canopy, intertwined with frosted evergreens, cloaked their position in near-impenetrable shadows. Here, in this remote corner of Belgium, the Germans felt shielded not only by nature's barriers but by the biting winter itself. The weather was relentless, gray skies thick with clouds, intermittent snow flurries, and a chill that seeped through even the heaviest wool uniforms. But for the German High Command, these conditions were not a hindrance, they were a strategic advantage. Months of careful planning had culminated in this moment. The Ardennes, with its rugged terrain, narrow roads, and tangled forests, was deemed an ideal launch point for the surprise offensive that would soon be known as the Battle of the Bulge. Senior officers, confident in their intelligence and the element of surprise, believed the Allies would be caught off guard. The Allies' air superiority, which had dominated the European skies for months, was grounded by the persistent bad weather. This grounding of Allied air support was a critical factor in German calculations. Without the threat of American fighters and bombers, the Wehrmacht expected to move swiftly and strike decisively. Within the German ranks, an aura of quiet confidence pervaded. Soldiers, many of whom had endured years of grueling combat, now found renewed morale bolstered by the promises of their leaders and the propaganda machine back home. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and whispered rumors heralded a swift breakthrough, an opportunity to reverse the tide of war that had, until then, steadily pushed Germany back toward its borders. The Ardennes was portrayed not just as a battlefield but as a proving ground where German valor and strategy would outmatch the faltering Allies. The scene was set with meticulous precision. Transport columns snaked through the frosted forest roads, their headlights dimmed to avoid detection. Artillery pieces were positioned in concealed clearings, while infantry units hunkered down among the trees, prepared to launch the offensive at a moment's notice. Radio operators buzzed with last-minute communications, ensuring orders were synchronized across the sprawling front. The commanders' faces, etched with fatigue but illuminated by determination, reflected a shared belief that this operation would catch the Allies unprepared and cripple their defenses. Underlying this confidence was a deep reliance on intelligence reports that painted a picture of Allied complacency. German reconnaissance had observed a lull in activity, interpreting it as evidence that the enemy was unaware of the impending assault. Previous quiet periods in the Ardennes reinforced this assumption, convincing German planners that their forces would encounter minimal resistance initially. The forest's natural defenses, combined with the secrecy of the buildup, were expected to deliver a tactical surprise of devastating effect. Yet, even as the German commanders plotted their offensive, the Ardennes itself was a landscape of contradictions. The dense forest, while offering cover, also presented logistical challenges: narrow roads susceptible to congestion, limited maneuvering space for armored units, and the ever-present threat of the harsh winter weather affecting both men and machinery. German soldiers wrapped themselves tightly in their greatcoats, their breath visible in the frigid air as they prepared for the grueling march ahead. The cold was unforgiving, seeping into bones and threatening to sap strength before a single shot was fired. Despite these hardships, the soldiers' spirits remained buoyant. Propaganda had instilled a belief that victory was within reach, that their sacrifices would soon be rewarded with a decisive blow against the enemy. Stories circulated among the troops of the Führer's resolve and the Wehrmacht's invincibility, reinforcing a sense of purpose. Many viewed the Ardennes as a proving ground where their skills and courage would shine, restoring Germany's honor and altering the war's course. The morning air was heavy with anticipation as final orders were dispatched. Units were instructed to advance swiftly and maintain strict radio silence to preserve the element of surprise. The plan envisioned a rapid breakthrough, cutting through the thinly stretched American lines and seizing key crossroads and communication hubs. Commanders expected that the poor weather and forested terrain would neutralize the Allies' technological and numerical advantages. In the German officers' mess, subdued conversations revealed a mix of cautious optimism and steely resolve. Veterans exchanged memories of past battles, comparing strategies and sharing insights on how best to exploit the Ardennes' challenging geography. Maps were scrutinized once more, highlighting critical junctions such as the road to Bastogne, whose control was deemed vital for the operation's success. Officers discussed supply lines, the coordination of armored spearheads, and the timing of artillery barges designed to shatter enemy defenses. Meanwhile, German engineers worked tirelessly to clear paths and lay mines, ensuring that advancing units could move unimpeded while hindering any potential Allied counterattacks. Communications teams set up radio relays in concealed locations, ready to coordinate the offensive's rapid pace. Behind the front lines, medical personnel prepared field hospitals, anticipating casualties but confident that the offensive's momentum would limit prolonged engagements. The soldiers themselves, many young and inexperienced, clung to the confidence of their leaders. Letters from home, promises of post-war rewards, and the camaraderie forged in the trenches helped steel their nerves. The cold, the darkness, and the uncertainty of battle were ever present, but the belief in the operation's success was a powerful salve against fear. As the hours ticked closer to the designated time, a quiet tension settled over the Arden Forest. Snowflakes drifted lazily onto the frozen ground, muffling sounds and creating a deceptive calm. German troops positioned themselves along the narrow forest roads, their weapons ready, engines idling softly in the cold. Commanders gave final nods, signaling their units to prepare for the assault that would soon shatter the stillness. The offensive's initial phase was to be swift and overwhelming. German forces planned to exploit the element of surprise, leveraging the forest's concealment and the weather's hindrance to Allied air power. The hope was that American units, scattered and unprepared for such a concentrated attack, would be overwhelmed before reinforcements or air support could arrive. In the minds of the German commanders and soldiers, the Ardennes was a fortress of opportunity, a natural bastion that, combined with their planning and resolve, promised to turn the war in their favor. This deeply held conviction shaped every movement, every whispered order, and every breath drawn in the cold December air. Yet, beneath this veneer of certainty lay a fragile reality. The forest's density, the unpredictable weather, and the resilience of the American forces waiting beyond the trees would soon put these assumptions to the test. But on this December morning, in the shadowed heart of the Ardennes, the German army prepared to unleash an offensive that they believed would be unstoppable. The German offensive in the Ardennes began under a veil of winter's persistent gloom, but what the Wehrmacht had not fully anticipated was the tenacity of the American troops stationed there. Initially caught off guard by the sudden onslaught, the U.S. forces quickly shed any shock and rallied with remarkable resilience. Despite being thinly spread and facing a numerically superior enemy, the Americans adapted swiftly to the harsh winter conditions and the unforgiving terrain, turning the dense forest and rugged hills to their defensive advantage. The snow-covered Ardennes was a forbidding landscape, with icy winds cutting through the trees and snowdrifts obscuring roads and supply lines. Both sides suffered under the weight of these conditions, but American soldiers, many of whom were veterans hardened by months of combat in Europe, had developed a gritty resolve. The cold was not just an environmental obstacle, it became a psychological battleground where endurance and willpower were as crucial as firepower. Detailing the engagements that unfolded, small American units found themselves holding vital crossroads and choke points, often in isolated pockets surrounded by enemy forces. Communications were sporadic, and resupply was a constant challenge, yet these soldiers refused to yield ground. At every turn, their presence delayed German advances, buying precious time for reinforcements to mobilize. The determination of these units became emblematic of the broader American defense, improvised, relentless, and unyielding in the face of overwhelming odds. Intelligence and communication played a pivotal role in this unexpected resistance. Despite the initial surprise, American commanders rapidly pieced together reports of German movements through intercepted radio transmissions and reconnaissance patrols. This flow of information allowed Allied forces to anticipate German thrusts and adjust their deployments accordingly. Radio operators, often working under fire, maintained lines of communication that proved essential in coordinating defensive efforts across the fractured front. One of the defining features of the American response was the use of terrain to offset German advantages. The narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes Forest limited the Wehrmacht's ability to maneuver large armored formations effectively. American infantry dug into concealed positions among the trees and rocky outcrops, establishing defensive strongholds that were difficult to overrun. Artillery units, though hampered by the cold and scarce firing positions, delivered devastating barrages that disrupted German formations and inflicted heavy casualties. The rugged terrain and brutal winter weather, while challenging, ultimately played into the hands of the defenders. German supply lines became stretched and vulnerable, with trucks and tanks bogged down in snow and mud. Mechanical failures and fuel shortages began to sap the momentum that German planners had counted on. Meanwhile, American logistics teams, though strained, managed to maintain a steady flow of ammunition and provisions to frontline units, often using ingenuity and determination to overcome obstacles. Among the most notable examples of American resistance were the smaller, scattered engagements where soldiers held out against repeated assaults. These skirmishes, often fought in bitter cold and under the cloak of dense forest, showcased the courage and adaptability of the troops. Units improvised defensive positions, constructed makeshift barricades, and employed hit-and-run tactics to harass German forces. Their efforts slowed the enemy's advance and disrupted the timetable of the offensive. The intelligence efforts of the U.S. forces extended beyond battlefield reconnaissance. Codebreakers and signal analysts worked tirelessly to decrypt German communications, providing strategic insights that shaped the broader Allied response. These behind-the-scenes operations, though invisible to the frontline soldiers, were crucial in undermining the Wehrmacht's element of surprise and enabling coordinated countermeasures. Communication networks, though fragile in the chaos of battle, were maintained with remarkable tenacity. Radio operators braved artillery fire and freezing temperatures to relay orders and updates. Couriers navigated snow-covered trails to deliver messages when technology faltered. This continuous flow of information fostered a cohesive defense that contrasted sharply with the fragmented German advances. American soldiers' determination was further bolstered by their belief in the justness of their cause and the support of home. Letters from loved ones, news from the front lines, and the knowledge that their stand was critical to the broader war effort infused them with resilience. Their actions on the ground reflected a deep-seated resolve to prevent the enemy from breaking through and threatening the heartland. The small unit engagements were often marked by fierce close-quarters combat. In the dense forests and snow-covered clearings, soldiers exchanged fire at close range, sometimes even resorting to hand-to-hand fighting amid the chaos. The brutal conditions heightened the intensity of these encounters, with cold fingers fumbling weapons and frozen ground complicating movements. Yet, the Americans' refusal to surrender positions, no matter how isolated, became a symbol of unyielding resistance. American commanders demonstrated remarkable flexibility in their tactics. Recognizing the limitations imposed by terrain and weather, they emphasized decentralized command, empowering junior officers and non-commissioned officers to make rapid decisions on the ground. This adaptability allowed units to respond effectively to shifting German attacks, exploiting local knowledge and initiative to hold key positions. The ruggedness of the Ardennes and the severity of winter also influenced the types of engagements that unfolded. Unlike the broad, mechanized maneuvers seen in other theaters, fighting here was often fragmented and chaotic, with firefights erupting in small pockets scattered across the forest. American troops became adept at using natural cover, camouflage, and silent movement to counter German patrols and reconnaissance efforts. Despite the initial shock, the American forces' ability to regroup and mount a resilient defense quickly eroded the Germans' confidence. Reports filtered back to German commanders that their advance was being slowed and that key objectives remained out of reach. The expectation of a swift breakthrough gave way to frustration as every mile gained came at a heavy cost and with increasing difficulty. The determination and improvisation of American troops were not just tactical responses but also reflections of a broader spirit. The soldiers had come to understand that their stand in the Ardennes could influence the entire course of the war in Europe. This awareness fueled a level of commitment that transcended individual hardship, forging bonds of brotherhood and shared purpose. In these early days of the offensive, the resilience of the American defense began to dismantle the carefully constructed German assumptions. The forest that had been seen as a protective shield for the attackers now became a gauntlet where their advance was contested at every turn. The poor weather that grounded Allied air support was mitigated by the soldiers' tenacity and effective use of intelligence. As American units held firm and countered German probes, the battle for the Ardennes transformed from a calculated German gamble into a grueling test of endurance and will. The initial shock of the offensive gave way to a protracted struggle, with the rugged terrain and bitter winter weather serving as both enemy and ally to the combatants. In this environment, the U.S. forces' ability to hold key crossroads and delay the enemy's advance proved decisive. These actions not only disrupted German timetables but also allowed time for reinforcements to arrive and for the broader Allied command to marshal a coordinated response. The American defense, born of quick adaptation, tenacity, and effective communication, had begun to unravel the German plan of a swift and decisive victory. As the bitter winter of 1944 pressed on, the battle in the Ardennes reached a pivotal moment when American forces, despite limited resources and the relentless cold, launched a determined counteroffensive against the German advance. What had begun as a surprise assault gradually transformed into fierce, close-quarters combat that tested the mettle of both sides. The dense forests and narrow roads, once considered obstacles, became the stage for a desperate struggle where tactical ingenuity and sheer willpower were paramount. American troops, many exhausted from days of defensive fighting, now shifted gears, seizing the initiative to push back against the encroaching Wehrmacht. The counterattack was marked by a coordinated use of artillery and armored support, despite the challenges posed by the terrain and weather. Artillery units, often positioned on precarious slopes or hidden in tree lines, unleashed barrages that shattered German formations and disrupted supply lines. Tank crews navigated treacherous forest paths with skill, providing critical firepower that bolstered infantry assaults. Among the most iconic episodes of this phase was the Siege of Bastogne, a small Belgian town that became the focal point of the German offensive and the symbol of American tenacity. Surrounded and encircled by enemy forces, the American 101st Airborne Division refused all calls to surrender. Their defense, conducted under freezing temperatures and with dwindling supplies, exemplified the steadfastness that characterized the broader resistance. Radio communications, famously punctuated by General Anthony McAuliffe's defiant reply, "Nuts," to a German surrender ultimatum, underscored the resolve that buoyed the defenders. The fighting around Bastogne and elsewhere was brutal and relentless. Infantry units engaged in close-quarters clashes, often exchanging fire at ranges so short that the crackle of rifles and the thud of hand grenades filled the air. The forested terrain limited visibility and maneuverability, making every advance fraught with danger. American soldiers dug foxholes in frozen ground, used fallen logs for cover, and improvised defenses with whatever materials were at hand. The cold exacerbated wounds and sapped energy, but the determination to hold ground prevailed. Strategic use of artillery was a linchpin of the counteroffensive. Despite limited ammunition and the difficulty of positioning guns in snow-covered forests, American artillerymen delivered precise and devastating fire upon German concentrations. These barrages not only inflicted casualties but also created chaos within enemy ranks, breaking up armored thrusts and halting infantry advances. Artillery observers, braving exposure to enemy fire, directed these attacks with remarkable accuracy, often relying on spotters perched in precarious positions. Armor, though constrained by the narrow and often muddy forest roads, played a critical role. Sherman tanks and tank destroyers maneuvered through the underbrush and over ice-slick terrain to support infantry operations. Their main guns and machine guns provided suppressive fire, enabling American foot soldiers to press forward or repel counterattacks. The mechanical resilience of these vehicles, coupled with crews' determination, allowed them to sustain operations despite frequent breakdowns and enemy fire. The counteroffensive unfolded amid a backdrop of worsening weather conditions that, paradoxically, aided the American cause. After days of heavy cloud cover and snow, skies began to clear, allowing Allied air forces to re-enter the fray. Fighter bombers and reconnaissance planes surged over the Ardennes, striking German supply lines, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. These air attacks disrupted the Germans' already strained logistics and provided much-needed support to ground forces engaged in close combat. German troops, who had counted on the weather to shield their movements, found themselves increasingly vulnerable. The arrival of Allied air support shattered the illusion of safety, forcing the Wehrmacht to contend not only with the tenacious American ground resistance but also with relentless aerial bombardment. Supply trucks and reinforcements became prime targets, and the constant threat from above compounded the difficulties of fighting in the harsh winter landscape. Logistical nightmares compounded German woes. Fuel shortages, ammunition scarcity, and the breakdown of vehicles hampered the offensive's momentum. As roads became congested with stalled tanks and supply convoys, the Germans struggled to maintain the pace necessary for their ambitious plan. The forest's narrow corridors, once an asset for concealment, now became traps that slowed movement and exposed units to concentrated fire. Within German ranks, morale began to falter as the initial confidence gave way to frustration and exhaustion. Commanders faced the grim reality that objectives were slipping beyond reach, and casualty lists grew longer with each passing day. The Wehrmacht's carefully choreographed timetable unraveled under the pressure of American resistance and environmental hardships. Soldiers, many of whom had entered the offensive with high hopes, now grappled with the starkness of a protracted and costly battle. Despite these challenges, German units fought fiercely to hold their positions and press the attack. Infantry assaults were launched repeatedly against American strongpoints, often resulting in bitter hand-to-hand combat. The forest echoed with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and shouted orders as both sides struggled for control over key terrain features. The cold and fatigue weighed heavily, but the determination to achieve victory kept soldiers moving forward. In response, American commanders capitalized on the opportunity to exploit German vulnerabilities. Counterattacks were timed to coincide with artillery barrages and airstrikes, maximizing their impact. Infantry units coordinated closely with armor and artillery, using combined arms tactics to punch through weakened enemy lines. These operations steadily eroded German positions, forcing retreats and inflicting further casualties. The battle for Bastogne remained a centerpiece of this phase. Surrounded and cut off, the American defenders endured relentless assaults and severe shortages of food, medicine, and ammunition. Yet their refusal to yield tied down significant German forces, preventing their redeployment elsewhere. Relief efforts, including daring supply drops by Allied aircrews, sustained the defenders until reinforcements could break the encirclement. As the counteroffensive gained momentum, the psychological impact on German troops became evident. The initial aura of invincibility was shattered by the Americans' unyielding defense and aggressive pushback. Reports from the front lines conveyed a growing sense of despair and uncertainty among German ranks. The contrast between the confidence at the offensive's outset and the harsh realities of combat underscored the shifting tide. This turning point was not merely a matter of tactics or firepower but a testament to the resilience and adaptability of American forces. Their ability to coordinate artillery, armor, and infantry under challenging conditions, combined with the renewed support of Allied air power, transformed what had seemed a desperate defense into a determined counterattack. The fighting in the Arden Forest became a crucible where American tenacity and ingenuity overcame formidable obstacles. The breaking of German lines during this counteroffensive marked a significant shift in the Battle of the Bulge. The momentum swung in favor of the Allies, who now seized the initiative and began to push the Wehrmacht back from its deepest penetration into Allied territory. The forests that had masked the initial German advance now witnessed the unraveling of their offensive. This phase of the battle demonstrated the critical interplay between terrain, weather, and military strategy. The Ardennes, with its dense woods and narrow roads, shaped the nature of combat, favoring determined defense and close cooperation among American units. The clearing skies enabled air power to tip the scales decisively. Meanwhile, German logistical struggles highlighted the limitations of even the most meticulously planned operations when faced with unforeseen resistance. The fierce combat, epitomized by the siege of Bastogne and the relentless American counterattacks, became emblematic of the broader struggle on the Western Front. It underscored the determination of U.S. forces to hold ground against overwhelming odds and the capacity of the Allied war machine to adapt and respond under pressure. As the German offensive faltered, the stage was set for the next phase of the battle, where the Wehrmacht would confront the grim reality of retreat and the unraveling of its ambitious plan. Yet, in these moments of close-quarters combat and strategic counterpunches, the American forces had demonstrated a resilience that would resonate far beyond the snowy depths of the Ardennes Forest. As the American counteroffensive gathered strength and German forces faltered, a grim realization settled among the Wehrmacht's commanders: their position in the Ardennes was rapidly becoming untenable. The initial optimism that had fueled the offensive in mid-December now gave way to a stark awareness of failure. The tightly coordinated German plan, once believed invincible, was unraveling beneath the weight of relentless American resistance, logistical chaos, and the resumption of Allied air superiority. Reports from the front painted a troubling picture. Supply lines were fractured, communication between units became sporadic, and reinforcements failed to arrive in the quantities needed. German troops, exhausted and demoralized, faced mounting casualties and increasing pressure from advancing U.S. forces. The once confident commanders now confronted the harsh reality that their forces were overstretched, vulnerable, and at risk of encirclement. Morale among German soldiers plummeted as the offensive stalled and the hope of a swift breakthrough faded. Many units found themselves in chaotic retreats through the snow-covered forest, their movements hindered by terrain and the constant threat of American attacks. Soldiers who had entered the battle with a sense of purpose now grappled with confusion and despair, their ranks thinning under continuous fire. Accounts from the front described scenes of disarray, with units fragmented and some soldiers surrendering to American forces rather than face annihilation. The psychological toll was profound. The belief in German military superiority, heavily reinforced by propaganda and years of battlefield success, was shattered by the resilience and determination of the American defenders. The shock of being pushed back after initial gains sowed doubt and fear among the troops. Commanders struggled to maintain order and discipline as retreat turned into a race for survival. The shifting momentum on the battlefield marked a critical turning point in the Western Front. The Ardennes offensive, intended as a decisive blow to Allied forces, instead signaled the beginning of the Wehrmacht's decline in the West. American and Allied forces seized the initiative, pressing their advantage to reclaim lost territory and push deeper into occupied Europe. Retreating German units faced formidable obstacles. The dense Ardennes Forest, which had earlier aided their advance, now complicated their withdrawal. Narrow, snow-covered roads clogged with disabled vehicles and retreating troops became death traps, susceptible to American artillery and airstrikes. The cold winter conditions, which had tested both sides, now exacted a heavy toll on the weary German soldiers, many of whom suffered from frostbite, exhaustion, and inadequate supplies. Despite the chaos, some German commanders attempted to organize orderly withdrawals and defensive stands to delay the Allied pursuit. Rearguard actions were launched to protect retreating forces, but these efforts were often piecemeal and insufficient to stem the tide. The fragmentation of German units meant that many soldiers were cut off from command structures, leading to isolated pockets of resistance that were gradually overwhelmed. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield to the broader German war effort. The failure of the Ardennes offensive undermined confidence in the high command and Hitler's strategic judgment. The anticipated last gamble had not only failed to achieve its objectives but had also depleted vital resources and manpower. This blow accelerated the unraveling of Nazi Germany's military position in the West. For the American forces, the successful pushback against the German offensive was a source of immense morale. Soldiers who had endured the bitter cold and fierce fighting now saw the fruits of their perseverance. The defense and subsequent counterattacks demonstrated the effectiveness of Allied coordination, logistical support, and the integration of air and ground operations. The victory at Bastogne and elsewhere became rallying points for the troops and the home front alike. The retreat through the Ardennes was marked by numerous instances of surrender, as German soldiers sought to escape the increasingly hopeless situation. The treatment of these prisoners by American forces, adhering to the Geneva Conventions, contrasted sharply with the desperation of the defeated troops. Many German soldiers expressed surprise at the relative humanity they encountered, a stark departure from the brutal warfare they had expected. The battlefield reality in the Ardennes underscored a profound shift in the nature of the conflict. The German army, once the unstoppable force that had overrun much of Europe, was now on the defensive, struggling to hold ground against a resurgent and better supplied enemy. The psychological erosion of the German fighting spirit was as significant as the physical losses sustained. As American troops pressed forward, reclaiming towns and severing German retreat routes, the Wehrmacht's capacity to sustain offensive operations diminished. The failure of the Ardennes offensive thus became a harbinger of the impending collapse of Nazi Germany's western defenses. Allied commanders recognized that the enemy was weakened and that the path to Germany's heartland was opening. The chaotic retreats through snowy forests and bombed-out villages were scenes of desperation. German soldiers, many young and ill-prepared for the harsh winter campaign, faced starvation, exposure, and relentless pursuit. The terrain that had once concealed their advance now exposed their vulnerabilities as the Americans tightened their grip. The collapse of the offensive was not just a military defeat but a psychological blow that rippled through the ranks. For the German High Command, the failure prompted a re-evaluation of strategy. The loss of men and material in the Ardennes depleted reserves that could no longer be replaced easily. Plans for future offensives were shelved in favor of defensive postures, as the reality of fighting a losing battle became undeniable. The retreat forced adjustments not only in tactics but in the broader war aims and expectations. The psychological impact on German troops was evident in letters and diaries discovered later, revealing a mixture of bitterness, disillusionment, and exhaustion. Soldiers questioned the wisdom of their leaders and the viability of continuing a war that seemed increasingly lost. This erosion of morale contributed to desertions, surrenders, and a decline in combat effectiveness. In stark contrast, American forces celebrated their hard-won successes but remained vigilant. The battle had exposed vulnerabilities and the cost of underestimating the enemy's resolve. Commanders understood that the war was far from over, but the victory in the Ardennes was a crucial step forward. It galvanized Allied forces and reaffirmed the belief that the German war machine could be defeated. The retreat through the Ardennes, filled with confusion and retreating columns, marked a symbolic and strategic turning point. It signaled not only the failure of the last major German offensive in the West but also the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's hold on occupied Europe. The psychological scars borne by German soldiers and commanders alike foreshadowed the collapse that would soon follow. Yet amid the chaos and retreat, stories of individual bravery, sacrifice, and endurance emerged. Both sides endured the brutal winter and fierce combat, but it was the Americans' ability to adapt, resist, and then counterattack that ultimately reshaped the battlefield. The Ardennes campaign became a testament to the complex interplay of morale, leadership, logistics, and terrain in determining the fate of armies. As the German forces withdrew, the momentum of the Western Front had decisively shifted. The Allies, invigorated by their resilience and growing superiority, prepared to press their advantage into the heart of Germany. The Ardennes, once thought a sanctuary for German victory, had become the crucible where the Wehrmacht's ambitions were broken and the final chapters of the European conflict began to unfold. The failure of the Ardennes offensive in the bitter winter of 1944 was more than a tactical setback for Nazi Germany. It hastened the collapse of the Wehrmacht's western defenses and reshaped the trajectory of the European conflict. What had been intended as a decisive blow to the Allies instead became a symbol of German overreach and Allied resilience, marking a critical turning point in World War II. The breakthrough achieved by U.S. forces during the counteroffensive reignited Allied morale at a vital juncture. Soldiers who had endured the harshest conditions and relentless fighting now found renewed hope as the tide of battle shifted decisively. The recapture of key towns and the relief of surrounded units such as the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne galvanized the entire Allied front, reinforcing the belief that victory in Europe was within reach. The Ardennes campaign dismantled long-held German assumptions about American military effectiveness and resolve. Prior to the offensive, German commanders had viewed Allied forces as overstretched and vulnerable, anticipating that their surprise attack would shatter the thinly held lines. Instead, the tenacity, adaptability, and coordination displayed by American troops disproved these expectations. The battle revealed the depth of Allied resources, the skill of their leadership, and the unyielding spirit of their soldiers. This unexpected American success had profound strategic implications. The failure to achieve the rapid breakthrough left German forces depleted and exposed, unable to mount further significant offensives in the West. The Allies seized the initiative, accelerating their push into Germany's heartland. Logistics, intelligence, and air superiority combined to sustain momentum, enabling the gradual liberation of occupied territories. The Battle of the Bulge, as the Ardennes offensive came to be known, became emblematic of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It demonstrated how determination and effective combined arms tactics could overcome initial surprise and numerical inferiority. The defense and eventual counterattack underscored the capacity of Allied forces to adapt to evolving battlefield conditions and to coordinate complex operations under severe pressure. Beyond the immediate military consequences, the battle had a lasting impact on the psychological and political landscape of the war. The failure shattered the myth of German invincibility and boosted Allied confidence. It also galvanized support on the home fronts, as news of the victory was celebrated as a sign that the Allies were closing in on ultimate victory. The Ardennes offensive tested not only weaponry and strategy but also the human spirit. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures, constant threat of attack, and scarcity of supplies. Yet their perseverance forged a narrative of courage and sacrifice that would resonate long after the guns fell silent. The battle became a source of pride and a defining chapter in the history of the U.S. Army and its coalition partners. In the aftermath, historians and military analysts examined the campaign as a case study in leadership, logistics, and the interplay of terrain and weather. The Ardennes highlighted the importance of intelligence, communication, and morale in modern warfare. It also illustrated the dangers of underestimating an opponent's capacity for resistance and adaptation. For the German military, the offensive's failure hastened strategic decline. Resources squandered in the Ardennes could not be replenished, and the loss weakened the already strained front lines. The campaign drained the Wehrmacht's ability to respond effectively to subsequent Allied advances, setting the stage for the final collapse of Nazi Germany. The success in the Ardennes also influenced post-war military doctrine and thinking. The battle underscored the necessity of flexibility, rapid response, and integrated operations combining infantry, armor, artillery, and air power. These lessons informed military strategies in the decades that followed, shaping the approach to combined arms warfare. Moreover, the battle's symbolism extended beyond the military sphere. It became a touchstone in American collective memory, representing the resolve and sacrifice required to defeat tyranny. Commemorations and memorials honor the soldiers who fought in the unforgiving forest, preserving the legacy of their courage for future generations. The Ardennes offensive's defeat was not simply a momentary lapse but a transformative event that altered the course of World War II in Europe. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, enabling the Allies to consolidate their gains and press forward relentlessly. The resilience shown by American and Allied forces during this campaign exemplified the broader struggle for freedom and democracy. In the final analysis, the Battle of the Bulge stands as a testament to the power of determination, coordination, and sacrifice. It dispelled illusions of invincibility, validated the strength of Allied collaboration, and hastened the liberation of Europe. The unexpected success of the U.S. troops in the Ardennes Forest remains one of the most significant military achievements of the war, a vivid reminder that even the darkest moments can yield triumph through courage and unity.